Your mom's a classy lady, and also a cool spaceship. It's NES Works, episode 117 with the Guardian Legend.
You lack personal hygiene, you understand that?
Bruderbund returns with an import localization that's just a little too quirky and a little too forward-thinking in incredibly specific ways to have come from any game design incubator besides Japan. It's the Guardian Legend. Now, I touched on this game not too terribly long ago in Metroidvania Works, but that really only concerned its place in the lineage of action role-playing games. Here, we're going to take a closer look at the Guardian Legend's place in the NES lineup and in the history of video games as a whole. The Guardian Legend, of course, comes to us from Compile, whose work we've seen fairly frequently here on NES Works, and in abundance on Seigaiden. Compile dabbled extensively in many different genres, exploring any number of concepts throughout their lifetime, ranging from billiards to puzzle games. The company especially shined when it came to shooters, and their work tended to push the limits of its respective hardware while pursuing interesting gameplay. Think Gulkov and Zanuck, technical showcases with inventive power-up schemes. The company also demonstrated a surprising knack for action RPGs as well. Their most notable release in that area was Golvelius for Master System. But they also did some impressive contract work for other publishers, including the Famicom port of Romancia and Higemaru Makaijima for Capcom. The Guardian Legend combines both of these disciplines into a delicious stew, whose main ingredient consists of the question, what if The Legend of Zelda skipped the dungeon element in favor of Zanuck scenes? It's a weird question, but I'm grateful that they took the time to ask it, because it resulted in a truly memorable creation. In the process, the company more or less reinvented both the action RPG and the shooter. The Guardian Legend places an emphasis on twitch skill that you rarely see in action RPGs, even in Compile's own Golvelius, while introducing not only a sense of persistence, but of permanence that goes beyond even the most complex power-up schemes found in regular shooters. The format of the game resembles an inverted balance of the Blaster Master dichotomy, where that game treated the vehicular scenes as the exploratory action RPG component, thanks to the player's ability to beef up their battle tank's capabilities over the course of the adventure, and relegated the on-foot sequences to a fairly vapid top-down shooter. The Guardian Legend does the opposite. Here, the multi-format action turns the vehicular sequences into simple shooting challenges, while placing the action RPG components primarily within the top-down, on-foot scenes. Although in this case, the line between vehicular and character action blurs considerably, given that the main character is the vehicle. The Guardian Legend is very much a product of its time. You play as Miria, a cute girl in sexy bikini armor straight out of mid-80s anime, who can also transform into a spaceship. Did you get your Letta in my Zeta Gundam, or did I get my Zeta Gundam in your Letta? The world may never know. Miria finds her way into the core of an artificial planetoid called Naju, which has appeared suddenly in Earth's local space in a way very unlike your usual massive celestial object. It turns out Naju is an evil artificial planetoid full of monsters and bad vibes, and Naju will cause the destruction of all life on Earth. So Miria flies out to intercept Naju and activate its convenient self-destruct mechanism. In order to do this, she needs to defeat the bosses who defend each of the planetoid's inner corridors. And she can only access and survive the corridors by traveling through the planet's labyrinth. Here we find the setup for the game's division of action. You wander the labyrinth on the surface in order to uncover and unlock the gates of each of the corridors. Then you battle through each corridor to destroy the boss within, which usually allows you to move along to the next phase of the action. This effectively amounts to a decompressed take on the Guardian Legend's predecessor, an MSX shooter called Gartic. Gartic looked superficially like a normal shooter, but that impression quickly faded once the game began in earnest. Consisting of a series of single-screen shooting challenges, Gartic allowed players to move from one screen to another once they defeated all enemies in the current scene. The trick was that you could often choose which direction to move when shifting to the next screen over, allowing you to traverse a labyrinth of interconnected spaces as if Zelda or Pit-Pot suddenly became a shoot-'em-up. What you see in the Guardian Legend, called Gartic Gaiden in Japan, is simply the components of the original Gartic broken out into discrete formats. The labyrinth portions feel more like a traditional action RPG, and the shooting portions scroll in a single linear direction, as one would expect from a normal-ass space shooter. However, the Guardian Legend's distinct combination of the two offers something wholly unique in gaming. Despite breaking its play concepts into separate modes, the two formats retain substantial interplay by making the heroine your playable avatar in both a shooter and adventure formats. Powers and upgrades that Miria acquires in one mode transfer to the other. You boost her armor and acquire power or weapon upgrades by exploring the dungeons in adventure mode. And then, those enhancements translate into improved combat capabilities in the shooter scenes as well. Keys and weapons acquired by defeating bosses then carry back into the adventure zones, allowing you to range further and face more difficult environments in the labyrinth, which in turn improves your survivability in the shooter scenes, and so forth. It's a marvelous gameplay loop that applies part of the fundamental appeal of the action RPG to the shoot 'em up. Namely, the knowledge that even if you're not especially good at the action component of things, the RPG elements will allow you to eventually become powerful enough to tank the twitch parts. And it's not like the Guardian Legend tries to hide its nature from players. Anyone somehow expecting a pure Zelda-style adventure will immediately realize that it's no such thing as soon as they boot the prologue scene, a fast-paced shooter sequence. The first shooter scenario is tough enough that you might have to take a couple of stabs at it before you can defeat the boss, but it's balanced reasonably enough that anyone who has a few NES action games under their belt can hope to overcome it without too much trouble. And from there, anyone expecting a pure shooter will also be quickly rebuffed by the opening narrative and the transition to free-roaming overhead combat. The labyrinth consists of a single large hub with gates connecting to a number of corridors, as well as deeper areas of the labyrinth. As you venture outward from the main hub, the challenges you face grow progressively more difficult. Enemies attack more vigorously, appear more frequently, and soak up more damage. But again, Miria continues to grow in strength as she overcomes different challenges. You'll rarely find yourself limited to a single path for pursuing progress. Each labyrinth zone contains multiple corridor entrances, and while at first you might not be able to take on the intense shooting of the zone's boss lair, the supplemental corridors tend to be less overwhelming while offering prizes at the end that will boost your odds of survival against the boss. Miria can collect better armor, a dozen different sub-weapons, health upgrades, and enhancements for her primary weapon. She can also collect chips, a key component of the game design, and an example of the Guardian Legend's thoughtful balance. Chips serve as a secondary form of energy, a little like magic points in an RPG. But they do more than that. Chips function as currency, allowing you to buy new weapons and upgrades in the shops you find scattered throughout the dungeon. And as your chip level rises, your primary weapon grows in power. Finally, chips fuel your special weapons. They're expendable. This forces you to balance your use of powerful secondary attacks with the fact that doing so will diminish the power of your main weapon, and that you won't be able to restore your max base attack power until you manage to max out your chips again. The dynamic push and pull of potential power loss again calls to mind Blaster Master, where your top-down hand blaster upgrades could be sapped by taking damage from foes. Only here, you actually have agency over those downgrades. You can hang on to your chips and rely entirely on your main weapon if you like, or you can go in guns blazing and accept the fact that you'll return to the labyrinth with your default gun diminished. It's your choice, and in my opinion, this makes the Guardian Legend the first shooter to properly attempt to build on the risk-reward element of Galaga's Tractor Beam Sacrifice Gambit, where you could give up a life in order to double your firepower while also doubling your hitbox. By 1989, shooters had largely settled into simple, linear power-up systems like the one in Darius, or the occasional player-selected system like that of Gradius. The Guardian Legend's upgrade system, in which players acquire permanent alternate weapons and cumulative max strength boosts, was something entirely new in shooters. In fact, the give-and-take dynamic of chip expenditures was fairly new in gaming as a whole. It wouldn't really manifest in another game, at least not that I'm aware of, for another decade, when it appeared as a fundamental pillar of Final Fantasy VIII by way of the Junction system, which allowed you to boost your character stats by tying them to magic skills, and then forcing you to choose whether or not to weaken a stat by expending the associated spell in combat. This is a fresh, inventive take on two genres, the kind of mashup the NES library has proven increasingly adept at. That said, the Guardian Legend does have its shortcomings. The various labyrinth zones and corridors tend not to vary all that much from one another, outside of the background tiles, color schemes, and enemy spawns. And the overall flow of the action never really varies. You're always moving through the central labyrinth core to different zones, battling or avoiding the set enemy spawns on each screen, and poking around to find doors, upgrades, shops, mini-bosses, and corridors. Vertical combat zones always amount to a straight flight to the boss, with enemies presenting differing degrees of dickishness in terms of their placement and durability. And above all, the Guardian Legend's dual format design won't be to everyone's tastes. Because it's not a pure shooter, you can't power through while relying on simple reflex and memorization. You really need to power up the protagonist, if only to boost your durability and defensive power against the durable later foes. However, because it's not a pure action RPG, you can't avoid engaging with the twitch action in order to advance. I'd say the fact that the Guardian Legend includes a secret code that allows you to play only the shooter levels, but no equivalent code for only taking on the labyrinth sequences, tips Compile's hand. Clearly, they favor this as a shooter first, action RPG second. Still, as 8-bit shooters go, it's pleasantly forgiving. The Guardian Legend effectively gives you infinite lives. When you die, you restart at the entrance of the most recent labyrinth zone or corridor you've tackled, with all of your abilities intact. You carry all the sub-weapons you've collected into combat, and can jump into the menu at any time to select a new one. On top of that, you find upgrades for sub-weapons in order to enhance their power and effectiveness. The sub-weapons run the gamut from fancier guns to defensive shields. Knowing which weapon to use in a given situation, especially against corridor bosses, quickly proves itself a critical skill. In short, there's a lot to like about the Guardian Legend. It may be imperfect, yes, but it's inventive and artfully designed. Compile created a genuine showcase for the NES, one of the most creative shooters ever, and a pretty solid action RPG, too. It's a shame that so few other developers have attempted to duplicate Compile's work here. The most notable attempt showed up nearly 20 years ago at this point, with WayForward's Sigma Star Saga for Game Boy Advance. A flawed but well-meaning attempt to do the Guardian Legend thing with a heavier emphasis on the action RPG and story elements. Otherwise though, the Guardian Legend has largely been forgotten. But looking back to 1989, it was a real sleeper hit for the NES. And for those who actually gave it a try, it was a fun, fresh palate cleanser after the unapologetic brutality of Ninja Gaiden. Even Nintendo Power didn't initially have much to say about the Guardian Legend. It received a brief mention in the January-February 1989 issue, but not a full feature at the time of its release. No, the Guardian Legend wouldn't get a proper Nintendo Power blowout until half a year after launch, when a multi-page spread showed up in the November-December '89 issue. To me, that reads like the magazine belatedly realized that it had slept on an excellent release and scrambled to give it its due. I mean, that's the very definition of sleeper hit, so it kinda works. And thankfully, decent games tended to have longer shelf life back in the NES era, so it wasn't too late to snag a copy of the game by the time Nintendo Power gave it the deep dive that it deserved. Next time on NES Works, your head explode.